New Orleans. January 16, 1972. Super Bowl VI. The Miami Dolphins against the Dallas Cowboys. Tulane Stadium. 81,000 people. In the crowd, somewhere between the politicians and the celebrities and the men who own things, a couple takes their seats. The man is compact, controlled, unremarkable in almost every way, except for what he is wearing: a full-length chinchilla fur coat, a matching chinchilla hat. Beside him, a woman in a white fur that costs more than most people in Harlem make in a year. She is extraordinary: dark hair, high cheekbones, the kind of beauty that stops rooms. She is wearing diamonds. She is laughing at something he has said. She looks like a queen. He looks like exactly what he has spent the last 6 years working to never look like. 3 rows behind them, a DEA agent reaches into his jacket and pulls out a notepad. He writes 2 words. Found him. The man in the chinchilla coat is Frank Lucas. The woman beside him is Julie Farrow, or more precisely, Juliana Farrow Lucas, née Margarita Farrow, former Miss Puerto Rico of Cali, Colombia. They have been married for 4 months. The coat costs $100,000. The hat costs $25,000. The decision to wear them, to sit in 81,000 people's eye line, to exist in the most visible possible way, to be, for one afternoon, exactly what Frank Lucas had never allowed himself to be. This decision will cost him everything. It will accelerate the investigation that leads to his arrest by an estimated 2 years. It will bring the full attention of the DEA Special Investigations Unit to bear on a man who had, until that Sunday afternoon in New Orleans, been the most successfully invisible major criminal in American history. For 6 years, Frank Lucas had eaten in corner restaurants and driven unremarkable cars and worn brown suits and been nobody. He had built a $150 million empire on the principle that the most dangerous man is the man nobody sees. And then Julie walked into his life. And Frank Lucas, for the first time in his adult life, wanted to be seen. This is the story of why. And what it cost. The mythology of the Frank Lucas story tends to cast Julie Farrow as a supporting character. The wife, the woman who talked him into the coat. The beautiful liability who cracked the armor of the invisible man. This is too simple. And it misses what actually happened. Juliana Margarita Farrow was born in Cali, Colombia, in 1947. She grew up in a family of the Colombian middle class, not wealthy but comfortable, not powerful but connected. She was educated at Catholic schools, spoke 3 languages by the time she was 18, and possessed, by every account, an intelligence that matched her beauty and a will that matched both. She won the Miss Puerto Rico title, a competition that, in the context of Colombian society, carried significant social weight, in 1967. She was 20 years old. The win brought her to New York, to a world of events and parties and the particular social circuit that beauty pageant winners navigate in American cities. She met Frank Lucas in 1967 or 1968, accounts vary on the precise date, at a party in Harlem. The meeting was not engineered. It was not a setup. It was the ordinary contingency of 2 people arriving in the same room. What is clear is that Frank Lucas was not, at first, the man he would become to her. He presented himself as a businessman. This was technically true. The business was not specified. In the world Frank Lucas moved in the Harlem of the late 1960s, businessmen often did not specify their business, and people often did not ask. Julie Farrow asked. Not immediately. Not at the first meeting. But eventually, as the relationship developed, as the dinners became regular, as the conversations extended into the specific intimacy of 2 people who are genuinely interested in each other, Julie asked Frank Lucas what his business was. Frank Lucas told her. This is the detail that the mythology consistently softens or omits. Frank Lucas told Julie Farrow the truth about what he did. Not every operational detail. Not the Southeast Asian sourcing or the country boy's architecture. But the essential fact: he was in the drug business. He ran an operation that moved heroin through New York and other cities. Julie did not leave. She had a condition. The condition was this: she would marry him. She had decided she would marry him, and Julie Farrow, once she decided something, was not easily redirected, but he would treat her as a partner. Not a silent partner. Not a kept woman who looked beautiful at his side and asked no questions. A partner. Someone who knew things, who had input, who was not maintained in comfortable ignorance while her husband ran an empire she was not allowed to understand. Frank Lucas accepted this condition. It was either the best decision he ever made or the worst, possibly both simultaneously. Here is what the mythology gets consistently wrong about Julie Farrow Lucas. She was not the woman who distracted Frank Lucas from his operational discipline. She was not the emotional vulnerability that the invisible man failed to protect against. She was not, in any simple sense, a weakness. She was a force. And for a period, roughly from their marriage in September 1971 to the Super Bowl in January 1972, she was a force that Frank Lucas was learning to integrate into a life and an operation that had been built, entirely and deliberately, around a single person's vision and control. Julie brought things that Frank Lucas's operation had never had. She brought the specific social intelligence of a woman who had navigated the beauty pageant world, the Colombian upper-middle-class social circuit, the New York party scene, worlds where information moved through personal relationships, where who you knew and who trusted you determined what you could access. She understood social networks in a way that Frank Lucas, whose entire social strategy was invisibility, did not. She brought connections. Her family in Colombia, the Farrow family's various connections to Cali's social and business world, provided Frank Lucas with relationships that his operation had not previously had access to. Cali in the early 1970s was beginning to develop the infrastructure of what would eventually become the most powerful drug trafficking organization in history. Frank Lucas did not become part of that organization. His operation predated it and was structured differently. But the connections that Julie's family provided were not without value to a man who was always thinking about supply chain resilience. She brought a corrective. Frank Lucas was, in many ways, a man of extraordinary discipline. But discipline exercised in isolation, without any external check, tends to calcify into rigidity. Frank Lucas's operational decisions were made by Frank Lucas, assessed by Frank Lucas, and approved by Frank Lucas. The country boys were loyal, but not positioned to challenge his strategic thinking. Illinois Gordon and the other senior associates were capable operators but deferential to his judgment. Julie was not deferential. She disagreed with him. She challenged his assessments. She told him when she thought he was wrong, with the specific directness of someone who had decided that honesty was more valuable than comfort. Frank Lucas, who had spent his entire career managing information and controlling narratives, found himself in the unfamiliar position of being genuinely challenged by someone who was not manageable. He found this, by various accounts, both deeply uncomfortable and genuinely necessary. There is a version of the Frank Lucas story in which Julie is the crack in the armor, the single vulnerability that the DEA eventually exploited. This version is true, but incomplete. Because the crack in the armor was not simply that Frank Lucas loved Julie, and love made him vulnerable. The crack was that Frank Lucas, for the first time in his adult life, was trying to live in a way that was not entirely defined by the invisible empire. He was trying to have something that wasn't operational, something that couldn't be filed and secured and managed, something that was simply his, in the ordinary human sense of having things that matter to you. Julie was that thing, and having things that matter to you is, for a man who has built his survival on having nothing that can be taken, the most dangerous condition possible. The chinchilla coat has been interpreted in every account of Frank Lucas's story as a failure of discipline, as the moment when the invisible man forgot himself, as the breach in the operational security that had held for 6 years. This interpretation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. To understand why Frank Lucas wore a $100,000 chinchilla coat to the Super Bowl, you need to understand what the coat represented. Not to the DEA, not to the Italian mob, not to law enforcement or his competitors or anyone with a professional interest in his visibility. To Julie. Julie Farrow was not a woman who wanted to be hidden. She had been a beauty queen. She had won competitions, stood on stages, been applauded and photographed and celebrated. She had navigated social worlds where visibility was currency, where being seen, being recognized, being acknowledged was not a danger but a goal. She had married a man who was brilliant and powerful and in many ways extraordinary, and she understood, with a clear-eyed intelligence that characterized everything she did, that the life he was asking her to live was not entirely the life she wanted. She wanted to go to the Super Bowl. She wanted to wear something beautiful. She wanted to sit with her husband in a public place and be, for once, not the invisible partner of the invisible man, but a couple who existed in the world in a way that other couples existed. Frank Lucas had resources that could purchase, quite literally, any experience she might want. He had connections that could place them in the best seats at any event. He had money that made the logistical challenges of public visibility completely manageable. What he had never had was the willingness to use any of this. Julie changed that calculation, not through argument, though she made the argument. Not through ultimatum, though there was, by various accounts, a version of an ultimatum in the conversation about the Super Bowl. She changed it through something simpler and more powerful. She made him want to. Frank Lucas wanted to give Julie the experience she was describing. He wanted to sit in a stadium with his wife and watch a football game and be a man who was present in the world rather than a ghost moving through it. He wanted, in that specific moment, to not be the invisible man. He wanted to be seen. The quote was not a lapse. It was a declaration. It said, "I have built this. I have made this. This woman is mine and I am hers, and we exist here, in the world, visibly, because I have earned the right to exist this way." It was the declaration of a man who had spent 6 years being nobody, finally deciding to be somebody. The DEA agent 3 rows back was writing in his notepad. Frank Lucas did not care. For one afternoon, he did not care. The DEA's Special Investigations Unit had been building its case against Frank Lucas for 4 years. By January 1972. Richie Roberts and his colleagues had assembled substantial evidence of the distribution network, had identified the Blue Magic signature and product across multiple cities, had begun to understand the organizational structure of the Country Boys. What they had not been able to do was place Frank Lucas at the center of what they were documenting. Frank Lucas's operational discipline had kept him off the photographic record. The DEA had files on the Country Boys, on the distribution operation, on the financial flows. They had almost nothing on the man at the top. He had been, successfully and consistently, invisible. The Super Bowl changed this. The DEA agent who spotted Frank Lucas that afternoon, there is some dispute about exactly who saw him first, but the event is documented, filed a report that night. The report included a physical description, the location, the details of the coat and hat that made Lucas, for once, impossible to miss, and the name of the woman beside him. The woman beside him was the crucial element. Julie Farrow Lucas was, unlike her husband, findable. She had a social presence. She had relationships that existed in the documented world. She had a family in Colombia whose connections could be investigated. She had moved through the New York social scene under her own name, leaving the kind of records, party invitations, charity event guest lists, the ordinary documentary residue of a visible social life, that investigators could follow. The DEA followed. What they found, through Julie, was not direct evidence of operational involvement. Julie Farrow Lucas was not a criminal. She had not participated in the drug trafficking operation in any way that constituted legal culpability. But she was a thread, and threads, pulled carefully, can unravel things. Through Julie's social connections, investigators identified relationships. Through those relationships, they identified other relationships. The social network that surrounded Julie Farrow, the parties, the events, the circle of acquaintances that her beauty and her personality had built in New York, provided investigators with a map of Frank Lucas's social world that his operational discipline had never allowed them to access before. It did not directly crack the case. The case was cracked ultimately through the patient accumulation of evidence that Roberts and his team had been building for years. But it accelerated everything. It gave the investigation momentum and direction that it had been lacking. It transformed Frank Lucas from a name on a file to a person in the world, a person with a wife and a social life, and a presence that could be mapped and traced and eventually confronted. The coat cost $100,000. The investigation it accelerated cost Frank Lucas his empire. Here is the part of the story that is almost never told. When Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975, Julie Farrow Lucas was 27 years old. She had been married to him for 3.5 years. She was not charged. There was no evidence to support charges against her. She had not participated in the operation. She had not known the specific details of the sourcing, the distribution, the financial structure. She had known that her husband was in the drug business. She had known this from before they were married, had accepted it as part of the reality she was choosing, but knowing and participating are different things, and the law, occasionally, observes the distinction. She was not arrested. She lost everything else. The house in Teaneck was seized. The money, the visible money, the bank accounts and the investments and the assets that could be documented, was seized. The cars, the jewelry, the furniture, the accumulated material evidence of 3.5 years of extraordinary affluence, gone. What Julie Farrow Lucas was left with in January 1975 was herself. Her intelligence, her languages, her social grace, her extraordinary beauty, which was beginning to carry, in the specific way that beauty carries grief, the weight of what she had been through. She was 27 years old. She had a husband serving a 70-year sentence. She had a daughter to raise. She had nothing else. The mythology of the Frank Lucas story focuses on the chinchilla coat as the symbol of Julie's impact on the empire. The coat that was too visible, the coat that brought the DEA to their seats, the coat that cost Frank Lucas his invisibility. But the real cost, the cost that the mythology doesn't compute, was Julie's. She had made a choice. She had known, before she married Frank Lucas, what he was. She had asked for the truth and received it and chosen to stay. This is not the choice of a naive woman. It is the choice of an intelligent woman who looked at a situation clearly and made a decision. She was still paying for that decision in 1975, and in the years after. Frank Lucas cooperated with federal authorities. His sentence was reduced. He walked out in 1981. Julie raised their daughter. She worked. She built a life from the wreckage of what the empire had left her. She did not, by any account, define herself by what had happened. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be defined by anything except her own decisions. But the decisions she had made, the choice to marry Frank Lucas, the Super Bowl, the visibility that she had wanted and that had cost them both everything, these decisions were not free. Nothing in this story is ever free. Frank Lucas has spoken about Julie in many interviews across many years. The specific quality of how he speaks about her is different from how he speaks about everything else. He speaks about the operation with analytical precision, about the sourcing, the distribution, the country boys, with the specific, slightly proud detachment of a man describing something he built and believes in, despite its consequences. He speaks about Julie differently, with something that, in a man of Frank Lucas's emotional discipline, constitutes a great deal: openness. The specific openness of a man discussing the one thing that broke through the operational armor, the one relationship that was not managed, not controlled, not maintained through information discipline and strategic calculation. He loved her. This seems to be simply true, in the straightforward way that simple things are sometimes true inside enormously complicated lives. He loved her, and she loved him, and the love was real, and the love was the crack in the armor, and the crack in the armor brought the whole thing down. This is not a simple moral lesson. The moral economy of the Frank Lucas story does not permit simple lessons. The empire was built on devastation. Its fall, caused in part by a man's love for his wife, does not redeem the devastation. Frank Lucas's humanity, the specific, genuine humanity visible in how he loved Julie, does not offset the inhumanity of what the operation did to the communities it moved through. Both things are true. Both things are real. The invisible man was visible to Julie. From the beginning, she saw him, not the operational Frank Lucas, not the strategic genius, not the invisible emperor of Harlem's drug trade. She saw the man, and the man seen became visible in other ways. The coat was not a failure of strategy. It was a man saying, "She sees me, I exist, I am here." For one afternoon in New Orleans, Frank Lucas was not the invisible man. He was a husband, in a stadium, with his wife, who was beautiful, and who had asked him, for once, to be somewhere with her in the world. He gave her that. It cost them everything. And somehow, in the specific, irreducible complexity of what it means to be human inside an inhuman situation, it was worth it to him. That is not a lesson, it is a fact. The most dangerous thing in Frank Lucas's world was never the DEA, or the Italian mob, or the corrupted officers who might turn, or the competitors who might move against him. The most dangerous thing was the woman who made him want to be seen. And the most human thing, the only fully human thing in the entire story of Frank Lucas's empire, was that he let her.